Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading Chapter 8 of Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings. As always, you should buy the original book to support the author and his works and stuff. Anyway, Chapter 8. After the first day, the wind blew out, and the pale autumn sun reappeared. Their route southward led them along the Garion River, a turbulent stream that rushed down from the mountains on its way to the Gulf of Charak. The country was hilly and timbered, but since the wagons were empty, their horses made good time. Garion paid scant attention to the scenery as they trudged up the valley of the Garion. His attention was riveted almost totally on Silk's flickering fingers. "Don't shout," Silk instructed as Garion practiced. "Shout?" Garion asked, puzzled. "Keep your gestures small. Don't exaggerate them. The idea is to make the whole business inconspicuous." "I'm only practicing," Garion said. "Better to break bad habits before they become too strong," Silk said. "And be careful not to mumble." "Mumble?" Form each phrase precisely. Finish one before you go on to the next. Don't worry about speed, that comes with time. By the third day, their conversations were half in words and half in gestures, and Garion was beginning to feel quite proud of himself. They pulled off the road into a grove of tall cedars that evening, and formed up their usual half-circle with the wagons. "How goes the instruction?" Mr. Wolf asked as he climbed down. It progresses," Silk said. "I expect it'll go more rapidly when the boy outgrows his tendency to use baby talk." Garion was crushed. Beric, who was also dismounting, laughed. "I've often thought that the secret language might be useful to know," he said, "but fingers built to grip a sword aren't nimble enough for it." He held out his large hand and shook his head. Dernick lifted his face and sniffed at the air. "It's going to be cold tonight," he said. "We'll have frost before morning." Beric also sniffed, and then he nodded. "You're right, Dernick," he rumbled. "We'll need a good fire tonight." He reached into the wagon and lifted out his axe. "There are riders coming," Aunt Paul announced, still seated on the wagon. They all stopped talking and listened to the faint drumming sound on the road they had just left. "3 at least," Beric said grimly. He handed the axe to Dernick and reached back into the wagon for his sword. "4, Silk said. He stepped to his own wagon and took his own sword out from under the seat. "We're far enough from the road," Wolf said. "If we stay still, they'll pass without seeing us." "That won't hide us from Grollems," Aunt Paul said. "They won't be searching with their eyes." She made 2 quick gestures to Wolf, which Garion did not recognize. "No," Wolf gestured back. "Let us instead." He also made an unrecognizable gesture. Aunt Paul looked at him for a moment, and then nodded. "All of you stay quite still," Wolf instructed them. Then he turned toward the road, his face intent. Garion held his breath. The sound of the galloping horses grew nearer. Then a strange thing happened. Though Garion knew he should be fearful of the approaching riders and the threat they seemed to pose, a kind of dreamy lassitude fell over him. It was as if his mind had gone suddenly to sleep, leaving his body still standing there, watching incuriously the passage of those dark-mantled horsemen along the road. How long he stood so he was not able to say, but when he roused from his half-dream, the riders were gone and the sun had set. The sky to the east had grown purple with approaching evening, and there were tatters of the sun-stained clouds along the western horizon. "Mergos," Aunt Paul said calmly, "and 1 Grollem." She started to climb down from the wagon. "There are many Mergos in Sandaria, great lady," Silk said, helping her down, "and on many different missions." "Mergos are one thing," Wolf said grimly, "but Grollems are quite something else. I think it might be better if we moved off the well-traveled roads. Do you know a back way to Medalia?" "Old friend," Silk replied modestly. "I know a back way to every place." "Good," Wolf said. "Let's move deeper into these woods. I'd prefer it if no chance gleam from our fire reached the road." Garion had seen the cloaked Mergos only briefly. There was no way to be sure if one of them had been That same Asherak he had finally met after all the years of knowing him only as a dark figure on a black horse, but somehow he was almost certain that Asherak had been among them. Asherak would follow him, would be there wherever he went. It was the kind of thing one could count on. Dernick had been right when he had spoken of frost. The ground was white with it the next morning, and the horses' breaths steamed in the chill air as they set out. They moved along lanes and little-used tracks that were partially weed-choked. The going was slower than it might have been on the main road, but they all felt much safer. It took them 5 more days to reach the village of Winold, across some 12 leagues to the north of Medalia. There, at Aunt Paul's insistence, they stopped overnight at a somewhat run-down inn. "I refuse to sleep on the ground again," she announced flatly. After they had eaten in the dingy common room of the inn, the men turned to their ale pots, and Aunt Paul went up to her chamber with instructions that hot water be brought to her for bathing. Garion, however, made some pretext about checking the horses and went outside. It was not that he was in the habit of being deliberately deceptive, but it had occurred to him in the last day or so that he had not had a single moment alone since they had left Fowler's farm. He was not by nature a solitary boy, but he had begun to feel quite keenly the restriction of always being in the presence of his elders. The village of Winold was not a large one, and he explored it from one end to the other in less than half an hour, loitering along its narrow cobblestone streets in the crispness of the early evening air. The windows of the houses glowed with golden candlelight, and Garion suddenly felt a great urge of homesickness. Then, at the next corner of the crooked street, in the brief light from an opening door, he saw a familiar figure. He could not be positive, but he shrank back against a rough stone wall anyway. The man at the corner turned in irritation toward the light, and Garion caught the sudden white gleam from one of his eyes. It was Brill. The unkempt man moved quickly out of the light, obviously not wishing to be seen. Then he stopped. Garion hugged the wall, watching Brill's impatient pacing at the corner. The wisest thing would have been to slip away and hurry back to the inn, but Garion quickly dismissed that idea. He was safe enough here in the deep shadow beside the wall, and he was too caught up by curiosity to leave without seeing exactly what Brill was doing here. After what seemed hours, but was really only a few minutes, another shadowy shape came scraping down the street. The man was hooded, so it was impossible to see his face, but the outline of his form revealed a figure dressed in the tunic hose and calf-length boots of an ordinary centaur. There was also, when he turned, the outline of a sword belted at his waist, and that was far from ordinary. While it was not precisely illegal for centaurs of the lower classes to bear arms, it was uncommon enough to attract notice. Garion tried to edge close enough to hear what Brill said to the man with the sword, but they spoke only briefly. There was a clink as some coins were changed hands, and then the two separated. Brill moved quietly off around the corner, and the man with the sword walked up the narrow crooked street toward the spot where Garion stood. There was no place to hide, and as soon as the hooded man came close enough, he would be able to see Garion. To turn and run would be even more dangerous. Since there was no alternative, Garion put on a bold front and marched determinedly towards the oncoming figure. "Who's there?" the man demanded, his hand going to his sword hilt. "Good evening, sir," Garion said, deliberately forcing his voice up into the squeaky registers of a much younger boy. "Cold night, isn't it?" The hooded man grunted and seemed to relax. Garion's legs quivered with the desire to run. He passed the man with the sword, and his back prickled as he felt that suspicious gaze follow him. "Boy," the man said abruptly. Garion stopped. "Yes, sir," he said, turning. "Do you live here?" "Yes, sir," Garion lied, trying to keep the voice from trembling. "Is there a tavern hereabouts?" Garion had just explored the town, and he spoke confidently. "Yes, sir," he said. "You go on up the street to the next corner and turn to your left. There are torches out front. You can't miss it." "My thanks," the hooded man said shortly, and walked on up the narrow street. "Good night, sir," Garion called after him. Made bold by the fact that the danger seemed past, the man did not answer, and Garion marched on down to the corner, exhilarated by his brief encounter. Once he was around the corner, however, he dropped the guise of a simple village boy and ran. He was breathless by the time he reached the inn and burst into the smoky common room where Mr. Wolf and the others sat talking by the fire. At the last instant, realizing that to blurt out his news in the common room, where others might overhear, would be a mistake, he forced himself to walk calmly to where his friends sat. He stood before the fire as if warming himself and spoke in a low tone. "I just saw Brill in the village," he said. "Brill?" Silk asked. "Who's Brill?" Wolf frowned. "A farmhand with too much Angarak gold in his purse to be entirely honest," he said. Quickly, he told Silk and Barrack about the adventure in Falder's stable. "You should have killed him," Barrack grumbled. "This isn't Cherik," Wolf said. "Sendars are touchy about casual killings." He turned to Garion. "Did he see you?" he asked. "No," Garion said. "I saw him first and he hid in the dark. He met another man and gave him some money. I think the other man had a sword." Briefly, he described the whole incident. "This changes things," Wolf said. "I think we'll leave earlier in the morning than we planned." "It wouldn't be hard to make Brill lose interest in us," Dernick said. "I could probably find him and hit him on the head a few times." "Tempting," Wolf grinned, "but I think it might be better just to slip out of town early tomorrow and leave him with no notion that we've ever been here. We don't really have time to start fighting with everyone we run across." "I'd like a closer look at this sword-carrying Sendar, however," Silk said, rising. "If it turns out that he's following us, I'd rather know what he looks like. I don't like being followed by strangers." "Discreetly," Wolf cautioned. Silk laughed. "Have you ever known me to be otherwise?" he asked. "This won't take long. Where did you say the tavern was, Garion?" Garion gave him directions. Silk nodded, his eyes bright and his long nose switching. He turned, went quickly across the smoky common room, and out into the chill night. "I wonder," Barrack considered, "if we're being followed this closely, wouldn't it be better to discard the wagons and this tiresome disguise, buy good horses, and simply make for Morose at a gallop?" Wolf shook his head. "I don't think the Murgos are all that certain where we are," he said. "Brill could be here for some other dishonesty, and we'd be foolish to start running from shadows. Better just to move on quietly. Even if Brill's still working for the Murgos, I'd rather just slip away and leave them all beating the bushes here in central Sandaria." He stood up. "I'm going to step upstairs and let Paul know what's happened." He crossed the common room and mounted the stairs. "I still don't like it," Barrack muttered, his face dark. They sat quietly then, waiting for Silk's return. The fire popped, and Garion started slightly. It occurred to him, as he waited, that he had changed a great deal since they'd left Falder's farm. Everything had seemed simple then, with the world neatly divided into friends and enemies. In the short time since they'd left, however, he'd begun to perceive complexities that he hadn't imagined before. He'd grown wary and distrustful, and listened more frequently to the interior voice that always advised caution, if not outright guide. He'd also learned not to accept anything at face value. Briefly, he regretted the loss of his former innocence, but the dry voice told him that such regret was childish. Then Mr. Wolf came back down the stairs and rejoined them. After a half hour, Silk returned. "Thoroughly disreputable-looking fellow," he said, standing in front of the fire. "My guess is that he's a common footpad." "Brill's seeking his natural level," Wolf observed. "If he's still working for the Murgos, he's probably hiring ruffians to watch for us. They'll be looking for 4 people on foot, however, rather than 6 in wagons. If we can get out of Winold early enough in the morning, I think we can elude them altogether." "I think Dernick and I should stand watch tonight," Barrack said. "Not a bad idea," Wolf agreed. "Let's plan to leave about the 4th hour after midnight. I'd like to have 2 or 3 leagues of back roads between us and this place before the sun comes up." Garion scarcely slept that night. When he did, there were nightmares about a hooded man with a cruel sword chasing him endlessly down dark, narrow streets. When Barrack woke them, Garion's eyes felt sandy, and his head was thick from the exhausting night. Aunt Paul carefully drew the shutters in their chambers before lighting a single candle. "It's going to be colder now," she said, opening the large bundle she'd had him carry up from the wagons. She took out a pair of heavy woolen hose and winter boots lined with lamb's wool. "Put these on," she instructed Garion, "and your heavy cloak." "I'm not a baby anymore, Aunt Paul," Garion said. "Do you enjoy being cold?" "Well, no," but he stopped, unable to think of any words to explain how he felt. He began to dress. He could hear the faint murmur of the others talking softly in the adjoining chamber and the curious hushed tone that men always assume when they rise before the sun. "We're ready, Mistress Paul," Silk's voice came through the doorway. "Let's leave, then," she said, drawing up the hood of her cloak. The moon had risen late that night and shone brightly on the frost-silvered stones outside the inn. Dernick had hitched the horses to the wagons and had led them out of the stable. "We'll lead the horses out to the road," Wolf said quietly. "I don't see any need for rousing the villagers as we pass." Silk again took the lead, and they moved slowly out of the inn yard. The fields beyond the village were white with frost, and the pale, smoky-looking moonlight seemed to have leached all the color from them. "As soon as we're well out of earshot," Wolf said, climbing up into his wagon, "let's put some significant distance between us and this place. The wagons are empty, and a little run won't hurt the horses." "Truly," Silk agreed. They all mounted their wagons and set off at a walk. The stars glittered overhead in the crisp, cold sky. The fields were very white in the moonlight, and the clumps of trees back from the road very dark. Just as they went over the hilltop, Garion looked back at the dark cluster of houses in the valley behind. A single flicker of light came from a window somewhere, a lone golden point that appeared and then vanished. "Someone's awake back there," he told Silk. "I just saw a light." "Some early riser, perhaps," Silk suggested, "but then again, perhaps not." He shook the reins slightly, and the horses increased their pace. He shook them again, and they began to trot. "Hang on, boy," he instructed, reaching forward and slapped the reins down smartly on the rumps of the horses. The wagons bounced and clattered fearfully behind the running team, and the bitterly chill air rushed at Garion's face as he clung to the wagon seat. At full gallop, the three wagons plunged down into the next valley, rushing between the frost-white fields and the bright moonlight, leaving the village and its single light far behind. By the time the sun rose, they had covered a good 4 leagues, and Silk reined in his steaming horses. Garion felt battered and sore from the wild ride over the iron-hard roads, and was glad for the chance to rest. Silk handed him the reins and jumped down from the wagon. He walked back and spoke briefly to Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul, then returned to the wagon. "We turn off at the lane just ahead," he told Garion as he massaged his fingers. Garion offered him the reins. "You drive," Silk told him. "My hands are frozen stiff. Just let the horses walk." Garion clucked at the horses and shook the reins slightly. Obediently, the team started out again. "The lane circles around to the back of that hill," Silk said, pointing with his chin since his hands were tucked inside his tunic. "On the far side, there's a copse of fir trees. We'll stop there to rest the horses." "Do you think we're being followed?" Garion asked. "This'll be a good time to find out," Silk said. They rounded the hill and drove on down to where the dark firs bordered the road. Then Garion turned the horses and moved it under the shadowy trees. "This'll do fine," Silk said, getting down. "Come along." "Where are we going?" "I want to have a look at that road behind us," Silk said. "We'll go up through the trees to the top of the hill and see if our back trail has attracted any interest." And he started up the hill, moving quite rapidly, but making absolutely no sound as he went. Garion floundered about behind him, his feet cracking dead twigs underfoot embarrassingly until he began to catch the secret of it. Silk nodded approvingly once, but said nothing. The trees ended just at the crest of the hill, and Silk stopped there. The valley below, with a dark road passing through it, was empty except for 2 deer who had come out of the woods on the far side to graze in the frosty grass. "We'll wait a while," Silk said. "If Brill and his hireling are following, they shouldn't be far behind." He sat on a stump and watched the empty valley. After a while, a cart moved slowly along the road toward Winold. It looked tiny in the distance, and its pace along the scar of the road seemed very slow. The sun rose a bit higher, and they squinted into its full morning brightness. "Silk," Garion said finally in a hesitant tone. "Yes, Garion." "What's this all about?" It was a bold question to ask, but Garion felt he knew Silk well enough to ask it. "All what?" "What we're doing. I've heard a few things and guessed a few more, but it doesn't really make any sense to me." "And just what have you guessed, Garion?" Silk asked, his small eyes very bright in his unshaven face. "Something's been stolen. Something very important. and Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul and the rest of us are trying to get it back. All right, Silk said. That much is true. Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul are not at all what they seem to be, Garion went on. No, Silk agreed, they aren't. I think they can do things that other people can't do, Garion said, struggling with the words. Mr. Wolf can follow the thing, whatever it is, without seeing it. And last week in those woods, when the Murgos passed, they did something. I don't even know how to describe it, but it was almost as if they reached out and put my mind to sleep. How did they do that, and why? Silk chuckled. You're a very observant lad, he said. Then his tone became more serious. We're living in momentous times, Garion. The events of 1,000 years and more have all focused on these very days. The world, I'm told, is like that. Centuries pass when nothing happens, and then, in a few short years, events of such tremendous importance take place that the world is never the same again. I think that if I had my choice, I'd prefer one of those quiet centuries, Garion said glumly. Oh no, Silk said, his lips drawing back in a ferret-like grin. Now's the time to be alive, to see it all happen, to be a part of it. That makes the blood race and the earth breathe in it's an adventure. Garion let that pass. What is this thing we're following, he asked. It's best if you don't even know its name, Silk told him seriously, or the name of the one who stole it. There are people trying to stop us, and what you don't know you can't reveal. I'm not in the habit of talking to Murgos, Garion said stiffly. It's not necessary to talk to them, Silk said. There are some among them who can reach out and pick the thoughts right out of your head. That isn't possible, Garion said. Who's to say what's possible and what isn't, Silk asked, and Garion remembered a conversation he had with Mr. Wolf about the possible and the impossible. Silk sat on the stump in the newly risen sun, looking thoughtfully down into the still shadowy valley, an ordinary-looking little man in an ordinary tunic and hose, and a rough brown shoulder cape with its hood turned up over his head. You were raised as a Cendar, Garion, he said, and Cendars are solid, practical men with little patience for such things as sorcery and magic and other things that can't be seen or touched. Your friend Dernick is a perfect Cendar. He can mend a shoe or fix a broken wheel or douse a sick horse, but I doubt that he could bring himself to believe in the tiniest bit of magic. I am a Cendar, Garion objected. The hint implicit in Silk's observations struck at the very center of his sense of his own identity. Silk turned and looked at him closely. No, he said, you aren't. I know a Cendar when I see one, just as I can recognize the difference between an Errand and a Tall Nidrin or a Cherik and an Algar. There's a certain set of the head, a certain look about the eyes of Cendars that you don't have. You're not a Cendar. What am I then? Garion challenged. I don't know, Silk said with a puzzled frown, and that's very unusual, since I've been trained to know what people are. It may come to me in time, though. Is Aunt Paul a Cendar? Garion asked. Of course not, Silk laughed. That explains it then, Garion said. I'm probably the same thing she is. Silk looked sharply at him. She's my father's sister, after all, Garion said. At first I thought it was my mother she was related to, but that was wrong. It was my father. I know that now. That's impossible, Silk said flatly. Impossible? Absolutely out of the question. The whole notion's unthinkable. Why? Silk chewed at his lower lip for a moment. Let's go back to the wagons, he said shortly. They turned and went down through the dark trees with the bright morning sunlight slanting on their backs in the frosty air. They rode the back lanes for the rest of the day. Late in the afternoon, when the sun had begun to drop into a purple bank of clouds toward the west, they arrived at the farm where they were to pick up Mingin's hams. Silk spoke with the stout farmer and showed him the piece of parchment Mingin had given them in Doreen. I'll be glad to be rid of them, the farmer said. They've been occupying storage space I sorely need. That's frequently the case when one has dealings with Tall Nidrins, Silk observed. They're gifted at getting a bit more than they pay for, even if it's only the free use of someone else's storage sheds, the farmer glumly agreed. I wonder, Silk said, as if the thought had just occurred to him, I wonder if you might have seen a friend of mine, Brill by name, a medium-sized man with black hair and beard and a cast to one eye. Patched clothes and a sour disposition, the stout farmer asked. That's him, Silk said. He's been about the area, the farmer said, looking, or so he said, for an old man and a woman and a boy. He said that they stole some things from his master and that he'd been sent to find them. How long ago was that? Silk asked. A week or so, the farmer said. I'm sorry to have missed him, Silk said. I wish I had the leisure to look him up. I can't for my life think why, the farmer said bluntly. To be honest with you, I don't much care for your friend. I'm not over fond of him myself, Silk agreed. But the truth is, he owes me some money. I could quite easily do without Brill's companionship, but I'm lonesome for the money if you take my meaning. The farmer laughed. I'd take it as a kindness if you happen to forget that I asked after him, Silk said. He's likely be hard enough to find, even if he isn't warned that I'm looking for him. You can depend on my discretion, the stout man said, still laughing. I have a loft where you and your wagoners can put up for the night, and I'd take it kindly if you'd sup with my workers in the dining hall over there. My thanks, Silk said, bowing slightly. The ground's cold, and it's been some time since we've eaten anything but the rough fare of the road. Your wagoners lead adventuresome lives, the stout man said, almost enviously. Free as birds, with always a new horizon just beyond the next hilltop. It's much overrated, Silk told him, and winter's a thin time for birds and wagoners both. The farmer laughed again, clapped Silk on the shoulder, and then showed him where to put up the horses. The food in the stout farmer's dining hall was plain, but there was plenty, and the loft was a bit drafty, but the hay was soft. Garion slept soundly. The farm was not Falder's, but it was familiar enough that there was that comforting sense of having walls around him again, and that made him feel secure. The following morning, after a solid breakfast, they headed the wagons with the Tolnedron's salt-crusted hams, and bade the farmer a friendly goodbye. The clouds that had begun to bank up in the west the evening before had covered the sky during the night, when it was cold and gray as they set out for Morose, 50 leagues to the south.